An ex-con mechanic fixed an old lady's car for free, never imagining she'd leave him her estate. Such a simple act of kindness on that rain-soaked Tuesday afternoon, yet it would alter the course of 2 lives forever. Ray Donovan hunched over the engine of a battered Chevy, his calloused hands moving with practiced precision despite the persistent tremble that had plagued him since Lompoc. 3 years out of prison, and he still flinched at sudden movements. Still woke drenched in sweat from dreams of concrete and steel. Freedom had proved to be its own kind of cage. One built of suspicion, of doors that closed when people learned of his past, of jobs that vanished before they began. The small garage he'd managed to rent on the outskirts of town was hardly impressive. A corrugated metal shell with a leaking roof and secondhand tools. But it was his chance to rebuild something from the wreckage of his life. The sign outside Second Chance Auto Repair had been his one indulgence, though customers were scarce enough that some days the name felt more like mockery than promise. Rain drummed against the roof, finding the weak spots and dripping onto the oil-stained concrete floor. Ray wiped his brow with the back of his wrist, leaving a smudge of grease across his weathered face. 43 years old, and he looked 60. Time in prison, having carved deep lines around his eyes and mouth, turned his dark hair silver at the temples. The radio crackled with static between songs, the only company he'd had all day. No customers. Again, the rent was due in 3 days, and he was still $200 short. His parole officer's words echoed in his mind. Most cons are back inside within the first 5 years. Statistics, Donovan. Don't be a statistic. The sudden blare of a car horn startled him, sending a socket wrench clattering to the floor. Ray's heart hammered against his ribs as he forced himself to breathe. Just a horn, not a guard's whistle, not the sound of cell doors slamming shut. He stepped outside into the rain, squinting against the glare of headlights. An ancient Lincoln Town car had pulled up, its engine making the distinctive knock of a timing issue. Behind the wheel sat an elderly woman, her white hair arranged in neat curls, her small frame nearly swallowed by the massive vehicle. "Excuse me," she called through the partially lowered window, her voice thin but determined. "My car is making the most dreadful noise. I was hoping to make it home, but it seems to have other ideas." Ray approached cautiously, aware of how he must appear. Tall, broad-shouldered, tattooed, with prison-hardened eyes. People usually found reasons to be elsewhere when they saw him coming. "Let me take a look, ma'am," he said, softening his voice. "Can you pop the hood?" The woman fumbled for a moment before finding the release. Ray lifted the hood, immediately spotting several issues beyond the timing. The battery terminals were corroded, belts were worn, and there was a small leak in the radiator. It was a miracle she'd made it this far. "It's not good," he said, closing the hood. Rain ran down his face, mingling with sweat. "I can fix it, but there are several problems." The woman's face fell. She clutched her purse tightly, knuckles white against the worn leather. "How much will it cost? I'm afraid I'm on a fixed income these days." Ray hesitated. The parts alone would cost over $200, exactly what he needed for rent. He opened his mouth to tell her, then stopped. Something in her eyes, a quiet dignity mixed with worry, reminded him of his grandmother, who'd raised him after his parents died. The same woman who'd sent him letters every week for 7 years while he was inside, until her own passing 2 months before his release. "Let me get you out of the rain first," he said instead. "You can wait inside while I take a better look." The garage office was little more than a desk, a coffee maker, and a sagging couch, but it was dry. Ray cleared a stack of invoices from the couch so she could sit. "I'm Margaret Harrington," she said, smoothing her dress after she sat. "Most people call me Maggie." "Ray Donovan," he replied, offering his least greasy hand. Her fingers were cold and delicate as they briefly clasped his. "Would you like some coffee, Ms. Harrington?" "It's not great, but it's hot." "Maggie, please." "And yes, coffee would be lovely. Black with 1 sugar if you have it." Ray busied himself with the coffee maker, using the moment to think. The woman clearly couldn't afford major repairs, but he couldn't afford to work for free. He had his own life hanging by a thread. "Have you owned the Lincoln long?" he asked, handing her a chipped mug. 27 years, she answered with a small smile. "My Harold bought it new in 1995, the year before he died. I couldn't bear to part with it." Ray nodded, understanding attachment to the few things that connected you to better times. He had his father's watch, the only possession that had survived his prison term, though it no longer worked. "I need to check something," he said abruptly, stepping back into the garage. Rain continued to beat against the roof as Ray leaned against the Lincoln, his mind racing. He had parts that might work, salvaged from other vehicles, not new but functional. If he worked through the night, he could fix her car and still have time tomorrow to finish the Chevy for his paying customer. When he returned to the office, Maggie was examining a faded photograph on his desk. Ray as a teenager, standing proudly beside his grandmother in front of her small house. "Your mother?" she asked. "Grandmother," he corrected. "She raised me." Maggie nodded, setting the picture down carefully. "She has kind eyes. I imagine she was very proud of you." The simple statement hit Ray like a physical blow. Proud? His grandmother had watched him spiral into drugs and bad choices, had visited him behind plexiglass. Her eyes filled not with pride, but with a desperate hope that he would someday find his way back to himself. He'd been released too late to show her he was trying. "Missy, Maggie," he said, clearing the sudden tightness from his throat. "I can fix your car by tomorrow afternoon. No charge." Her eyes widened. "No, I couldn't possibly." "Please," he interrupted. "Let me do this." He couldn't explain why it mattered so much. Why this stranger's predicament had pierced the armor he'd built around himself. Maybe it was her resemblance to his grandmother. Or maybe it was simply that he was tired of being seen as nothing more than an ex-con, a statistic waiting to happen. "You're very kind," she said finally. "But at least let me bring you dinner tomorrow when I pick up the car. I make a decent pot roast." Ray found himself nodding, though he couldn't remember the last time he'd accepted kindness from anyone. "Das ist kein deal." He called her a taxi, insisting on paying for it despite her protests. As the cab pulled away, Ray stood in the rain a moment longer, wondering what had possessed him to make such an offer. He had no answer, only a strange feeling that somehow, after 3 years of freedom that didn't feel like freedom at all, something important had just happened. The night passed in a blur of work. Ray's hands moved methodically through the repairs, finding a rhythm that quieted his mind. By dawn, he had replaced the timing belt, fixed the radiator leak, installed a reconditioned water pump, and cleaned the battery terminals. The rain had stopped, leaving a crystalline quality to the morning light that streamed through the garage's small windows. He allowed himself 2 hours of sleep on the office couch before starting on the Chevy. By 3 o'clock, both cars were finished, and Ray had just enough time to wash up in the small bathroom sink before Maggie arrived. She came bearing 2 grocery bags and a covered dish that filled the garage with the rich aroma of beef and herbs. "I thought we might eat together," she said simply. Ray cleared space on his desk, oddly nervous as they sat down to share the meal. The pot roast was indeed decent. Better than decent, it was the most home-cooked thing he'd eaten since his release. They ate mostly in silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. "Your car's ready," he said finally, wiping his mouth with a paper towel. "I replaced several parts that were worn out. Should run much better now." Maggie set down her fork, studying him with clear blue eyes that seemed to see more than he was comfortable revealing. "Why did you help me, Mr. Donovan? And don't say it was nothing, because we both know that's not true." Ray stared at his plate. He could lie, make up something about good business practices or community goodwill. Instead, he found himself speaking the truth. "I've made a lot of mistakes in my life," he said quietly. "Spent 7 years paying for the biggest one. Since I got out, doors keep closing. People see the tattoos or they run a background check, and suddenly there's no job, no apartment, no chance." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I guess I wanted to be the one to open a door for once, instead of having it shut in my face." Maggie nodded slowly. "I understand more than you might think. When you reach my age, 86 next month, people start to look past you. They make decisions for you, talk over you, assume you have nothing left to contribute." She smiled faintly. "We're both invisible in our own ways, aren't we?" The observation startled Ray. He'd never thought of his situation in those terms, but there was truth in it. Prison had made him hyper-visible in all the wrong ways while rendering the person he actually was completely unseen. "Your work is excellent," Maggie continued. "You have genuine skill. Why aren't you working at a proper garage?" "Felony conviction," Ray said bluntly. "No one wants to hire me, and I can't afford the insurance premiums to get certified as an independent shop yet. I'm working under the table mostly, trying to save enough to make it official." "What was it?" she asked. "The felony." Ray tensed. This was usually where conversations ended. "Armed robbery. I was high, desperate for my next fix. Held up a convenience store." His voice grew quieter. "The clerk had a heart condition. The stress triggered a heart attack. He survived, but I could have killed him with my stupidity." He waited for the familiar shift, the subtle pulling away, the change in expression from interest to caution. It didn't come. "And now?" Maggie asked. Clean for 10 years, Ray said. Started in prison. It's the only good thing that came out of that place. Maggie reached across the desk and did something no one but his grandmother had done in years. She placed her hand over his. Thank you for fixing my car, Ray, and for your honesty. After she left, Ray stood in the doorway of his garage, watching the Lincoln pull smoothly away. An odd emptiness settled over him, as if something valuable had slipped through his fingers. He told himself it was ridiculous to feel this way about a customer, even one who had treated him like a human being rather than a cautionary tale. He didn't expect to see Maggie Harrington again, but 3 days later she returned with a thermos of homemade soup and a small stack of books. I thought you might enjoy these, she said, placing them on his desk. Harold was a mechanic too, before he opened his own shop. These were his favorites. Ray examined the books, detailed guides to engine repair, classic car restoration, and automotive electrical systems. They were well worn, with notes in the margins and pages marked with faded tabs. These are... Thank you, he managed, oddly moved by the gesture. But don't you want to keep them? Maggie shook her head. Books should be used, not stored. Besides, I think Harold would approve. That visit became the first of many. Every few days, Maggie would appear with food or books or simply to talk. Ray learned she had been a high school English teacher before retirement, that she had no children, that Harold had been the love of her life, and that since his death 26 years ago, she had lived alone in the house they had shared for nearly 4 decades. In turn, he found himself sharing pieces of his own story, his childhood with his grandmother after his parents' fatal car accident, his descent into addiction following her cancer diagnosis, the foggy years lost to drugs, and the harsh clarity of prison. He told her about his dream to build a legitimate business, to someday own a real shop instead of renting this dilapidated garage. Weeks turned into months. Maggie began bringing him occasional customers, friends from her church, former colleagues, neighbors. People who might otherwise have avoided a place like Second Chance Auto Repair gave Ray a chance because Maggie vouched for him. Slowly, his business grew. When winter arrived, bringing bitter cold to the unheated garage, Maggie appeared with a space heater and a heavy wool coat that had belonged to Harold. It's just gathering dust, she insisted when Ray protested. And you're about his size. He was a tall man too. The coat fit perfectly, warming Ray in ways that went beyond the physical. Sometimes, working late into the night, he imagined he could still detect the faint scent of pipe tobacco that Maggie had mentioned was Harold's signature indulgence. One snowy February morning, Ray arrived at the garage to find Maggie waiting in her car, engine running to stay warm. Her face was pale, her usually immaculate hair disheveled. I'm sorry to bother you so early, she said as he approached, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. But I seem to be having trouble with the heat in my house. The furnace is making an odd noise, and it's quite cold inside. Ray followed her home in his truck, concern growing when he saw the modest but well-maintained craftsman house where she lived. From her descriptions, he had imagined something grander. Inside, the house was indeed freezing, with a bone-deep chill that suggested the furnace had been out for hours. The problem turned out to be relatively simple, a failed igniter that Ray was able to temporarily bypass until proper parts could be obtained. As the house slowly warmed, he noticed Maggie's hands shaking as she tried to pour coffee. Are you feeling all right? He asked, gently taking the pot from her. Just tired, she said with a dismissive wave. I didn't sleep well with the cold. But as Ray finished his work on the furnace, he observed other troubling signs. Maggie pausing mid-sentence as if losing her train of thought, wincing when she moved too quickly, the untouched pill organizer on the kitchen counter. Maggie, he said carefully as they sat at her kitchen table. When was the last time you saw your doctor? She looked away. Doctors are expensive. You have Medicare, don't you? There's a gap, she admitted reluctantly. And I've been trying to be careful with expenses lately. Ray felt a chill that had nothing to do with the furnace. What about your retirement? You mentioned you had a pension from teaching. Maggie's fingers twisted together on the table. The school district had some financial troubles a few years ago. The pension fund, it's complicated, but the monthly amount was reduced substantially. She attempted a smile that didn't reach her eyes. I'm managing, but looking around, Ray could see signs that told a different story. The thermostat set too low, the nearly empty refrigerator he'd glimpsed when getting milk for coffee, the stack of unopened bills on the sideboard. Let me help, he said impulsively. I can check the house for other repairs, make sure everything's working efficiently. Might help with the utility bills. Over Maggie's protests, Ray spent the next several weekends at her house, insulating windows, fixing leaky faucets, servicing the ancient water heater, and making dozens of small repairs that had been neglected. He refused any payment, insisting it was simply repayment for all the customers she had sent his way. The truth was more complicated. In Maggie, Ray had found something he thought he'd lost forever when his grandmother died. A connection to the world of decent, ordinary people who lived their lives without the shadow of prison hanging over them. She treated him not as an ex-con, but as a skilled craftsman, a person worthy of respect and friendship. Spring arrived, bringing with it a steady increase in business for Ray. He was finally able to pay his rent on time, even beginning to set aside small amounts toward proper certification. Maggie continued her regular visits to the garage, though Ray noticed she tired more easily, sometimes pausing to catch her breath or rubbing her temples as if fighting a headache. "You should see a doctor," he urged after finding her sitting in her car one afternoon, looking disoriented. "Please, Maggie, I'm worried about you." She finally agreed, allowing Ray to drive her to an appointment the following week. The diagnosis came swiftly and without mercy. Advanced pancreatic cancer, already spreading to her liver. Treatment options were limited. The prognosis measured in months rather than years. "I suspected something wasn't right," Maggie said quietly as they sat in her living room afterward, a spring rain pattering against the windows. "I just didn't want to know how bad it was." Ray felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath his feet. He had lost everyone who mattered, his parents, his grandmother, and now Maggie too would leave. The familiar urge to escape, to numb himself with chemicals until the pain subsided, surfaced for the first time in years. Instead, he took a deep breath and asked, "What can I do?" What followed was a crash course in home hospice care. Ray learned to administer medications, to recognize the signs of pain that Maggie tried to hide, to help her move from bed to chair when her strength failed. He continued to run his garage during the day, but evenings and nights were spent at Maggie's house, sleeping on her couch to be nearby if she needed him. "You don't have to do this," Maggie told him one evening as he helped her into bed. "You have your own life to live." "This is my life right now," Ray answered simply. As spring yielded to summer, Maggie's condition deteriorated rapidly. There were good days when she was almost her old self, sitting in the garden Ray had restored for her, discussing books or sharing stories. But increasingly, there were bad days of pain and confusion when the medications barely took the edge off her suffering. On a warm July evening, as fireflies blinked in the gathering dusk, Maggie asked Ray to help her to the porch swing. They sat together in comfortable silence, watching darkness claim the garden. "I want to show you something," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. From the pocket of her robe, she withdrew an envelope. "This is for you. Don't open it until after. Promise me." Ray took the envelope, his throat tight. "I promise." "You've given me a great gift, Ray," she continued. "These last months could have been so lonely. Instead, they've been filled with friendship and dignity." She reached for his hand. "I want you to know that you've more than repaid any kindness I showed you. Your grandmother would be very proud of the man you've become." 3 days later, Maggie slipped away peacefully in her sleep, Ray holding her hand as the first light of dawn filtered through the bedroom curtains. The world seemed impossibly empty in the hours that followed, as he made the necessary calls and arrangements according to the detailed instructions Maggie had left. The funeral was small but well attended. Former students, colleagues, neighbors. Ray stood at the back, Harold's coat buttoned despite the summer heat, feeling like an intruder among people who had known Maggie for decades rather than months. Several people approached him afterward, thanking him for caring for her, inviting him to the reception at a former colleague's home. He couldn't face it. Instead, he drove to his garage, sat in the darkness surrounded by tools and the lingering scent of motor oil, and finally allowed himself to grieve. When the tears subsided, he remembered the envelope. With trembling fingers, he opened it to find a letter and a key. "Dear Ray," the letter began in Maggie's neat handwriting. "If you're reading this, I have left this world for whatever comes next. I hope it involves books and gardens and no pain. I've had a good life, Ray, even with its sorrows and disappointments. My greatest regret was having no family to whom I could pass along the fruits of Harold's and my years of work. Until you fix my car, I believe people come into our lives exactly when they're meant to. You needed someone to see beyond your past to the good man you truly are. I needed someone to remind me that human connection doesn't end with age or illness. The enclosed key is to a safe deposit box at First National Bank. Inside you will find my will and the deed to my house and property. I have left everything to you, Ray. The house, Harold's old workshop behind the garage, my modest savings, all of it. My attorney, James Wilson, has all the necessary paperwork. His number is below. There may be those who question my decision or even challenge it. James is prepared for this possibility and has video documentation of my wishes, recorded when I was still clearly of sound mind. The house needs someone who will care for it as we did. The workshop has stood empty since Harold died. He would be pleased to know another mechanic will use his tools. And I can think of no better use for whatever financial resources remain than to help you establish the business you dream of. This is not charity, Ray. It is investment in a good man who helped me when he had nothing to gain. It is belief in second chances. It is recognition that family can be found in unexpected places. Live well. Be kind. Remember that everyone deserves the chance to be seen for who they truly are, not just for their mistakes or circumstances. With great affection and absolute confidence in you, Maggie, Ray read the letter 3 times, his mind struggling to comprehend what it meant. The next day, still dazed, he met with James Wilson, a kindly older attorney who patiently explained the details of Maggie's bequest. The house was fully paid for. The workshop behind it, which Ray had never seen, turned out to be a fully equipped mechanic's garage that Harold had built for his retirement projects. There was a modest investment account, insurance policies, and even a small collection of classic car parts that Harold had accumulated over the years. She changed her will after her diagnosis. James explained. She was very clear about her wishes, and we took extra precautions to document her competence, given the circumstances. But why me? Ray asked, the question that had been echoing through his mind since reading the letter. She barely knew me. James smiled gently. Maggie was an excellent judge of character. Always had been, according to Harold. She told me she recognized something in you that reminded her of him. A fundamental decency beneath a rough exterior. He shuffled some papers. Besides, she had no close family. Her estate would have gone to distant cousins she hadn't seen in decades. In the weeks that followed, Ray moved through a fog of grief and disbelief. He continued to operate his rented garage while slowly exploring the house that was now, impossibly, his. Each room held traces of Maggie and Harold, photographs, books, the accumulated treasures of a long life well lived. The workshop behind the house was a revelation, spacious and well-designed, with large doors that opened onto the alley behind the property. It had clearly been built by someone who understood the needs of a mechanic. The tools were older, but of excellent quality, arranged with the precision of a craftsman who respected his instruments. On a workbench in the corner, Ray found a framed photograph of a younger Harold standing proudly beside a restored 1957 Chevrolet. The resemblance to Ray's own stance in the photo with his grandmother was startling. The same squared shoulders, the same hint of a smile not quite hidden beneath a serious expression. Gradually, an idea began to form. The location was perfect, a residential neighborhood, but with the workshop already zoned for business use. With the money from Maggie's estate, he could finally obtain the proper licensing and insurance. He could create the legitimate business he had dreamed of, not in the dilapidated rental garage, but here, in a place built with love by another mechanic. 6 months after Maggie's passing, Second Chance Classics opened its doors. Specializing in restoration and repair of vintage vehicles, the shop quickly developed a reputation for quality work and fair prices. Ray hired 2 assistants, one a recent high school graduate with an interest in mechanics, the other a middle-aged woman recently released from prison for financial fraud, who needed, as Ray put it simply, a second chance. The house remained largely as Maggie had left it, though Ray eventually converted one room into an office for the business. He kept her garden, learning through trial and error how to tend the perennials she had nurtured for decades. In the evenings, he often sat on the porch swing, watching fireflies and thinking of the strange, winding path that had led him here. On the first anniversary of Maggie's death, Ray closed the shop early and drove to the cemetery with a bouquet of daisies, her favorite, he had learned from her journals. As he placed them on her grave beside Harold's, he noticed an elderly man doing the same at a nearby headstone. Friend or family? The man asked, nodding toward Maggie's grave. Ray considered the question. Both, he said finally. She gave me a second chance when I needed it most. The man nodded as if this made perfect sense. That sounds like Maggie. She taught my daughter English years ago. Always believed people could be more than their worst mistakes. I'm trying to live up to that belief, Ray said quietly. Seems to me you already are. The man replied, gesturing to the Second Chance Classics logo on Ray's shirt. Heard good things about your shop. Might bring my Oldsmobile in one of these days. As the man walked away, Ray remained by the grave, the setting sun warming his face. He thought about chains, the literal ones he had worn in prison, and the invisible ones he had carried for years afterward. He thought about doors closing and opening, about unexpected kindness and its power to transform a life. An ex-con mechanic had fixed an old lady's car for free, never imagining she'd leave him her estate. But the true inheritance Maggie had left wasn't measured in property or money. It was the profound understanding that redemption comes not through grand gestures, but through small acts of decency repeated daily. It was the knowledge that everyone deserves to be seen not just for who they were, but for who they are trying to become. Ray placed his hand on the sun-warmed stone. "Thank you," he whispered, and in the gentle evening breeze, he could almost hear Maggie's voice replying, "You're welcome. Now go live the life you've earned." And so he did.